What are they brewing about? Well, I don't know. Well, welcome to the Mindful Cranks, where using your mind is not necessarily a bad thing, and where being cranky can actually be mindful. Let's crank it up. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Michael Ungar, who is a professor of social work at Dalhousie University and Canada Research Chair in Child, Family, and Community Resilience, as well as a family therapist, about his new book, Change Your World, The Science of Resilience and the Path to Success, published by Sutherland House Books in 2019. Michael, in this interview, dispels many of the myths of the self-help industry with its victim-blaming messages, which has emulated the rugged individual and has espoused a cruel form of optimism in success and happiness, the idea that success and happiness can all be self-determined by simply pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps and changing yourself. Using the science of resilience, based on his years of research on children, families, and communities, Michael tells us that resilience has more to do with the resourced individual and changing the environment. Whether that means having supportive and nurturing spouses and families, supportive employers and corporations, and effective institutions. The good news is that we can change our worlds, and that's actually more effective than the tropes we've been hearing that all change comes from within. Dr. Michael Ungar is among the best-known writers and researchers on the topic of resilience. His work has changed the way resilience is understood, shifting the focus from individual traits to the interactions between people and their families, schools, workplaces, and communities. He is the author of 15 books that have been translated into 5 languages, numerous manuals for parents, educators, and employers, as well as more than 170 scientific papers. I think you will enjoy this episode. Well, welcome, Michael, to the Mindful Cranks. We've been wanting to do this interview for a while, and today we're going to be talking about your book, which is just a remarkable book, Change Your World, The Science of Resilience and the True Path to Success, published by Sutherland House in 2019. So thank you for coming on the Mindful Cranks, Michael.
A real pleasure, Ron. Great to be here.
I'd like to jump in right into the book. You say right out that there's a difference. Well, first of all, your book is based on a lot of your research over the years, and to me, it's the first book that I've come across that diverges from the popularized notions of resilience that has been coming out of the positive psychology and happiness industry, and grit is the latest fad. But you talk. You say right. Well, let me back up. What led you to study resilience? Maybe we should start there.
Well, I got interested in the topic because I was working as a mental health clinician with a lot of very vulnerable kids in mental health settings, street youth, child welfare settings, whatever. And you just, if you're open to it, you see kids who are beating the odds, who seem to be, they're frankly coping quite well. They're getting on with their lives. And by all reasoning, they shouldn't be, given what's happened to them. But the problem with most psychology, or the study of psychology and social work and psychiatry, is that we focus so much on the children who don't survive. And we forget to ask maybe the more important question, which is part of the whole, it's kind of like the counter argument to the adverse childhood experiences materials that says, if you had these bad things happen to you as a kid, then these bad things tend to happen to you as an adult, such as heart disease, mental illnesses, addiction problems. But a lot of people don't experience those things. So what I began to get curious about is what explained, the way I like to say it is the top of the bar graph, the group of people that don't appear in the statistics where in terms of all the people that break down, that don't get through life well, there's a lot of people that do, and the mechanisms, or if you will, they are the experts on what leads to success if you go and ask them the right questions.
Yeah, and you argue and make claims based on a lot of international studies that you've conducted that it's not grit, it's not just our ability to be mindful or to tap into our inner resources that helps us overcome adversity. Rather, you say it's our ability to navigate and tap into meaningful resources. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is it's really interesting. If you, I mean, unfortunately, if you looked at what most of the research on things like resilience or grit, etc., they're almost always done with people who, well, frankly, have a fair number of resources, a lot going for them. They're, the ubiquitous university student who is sitting in a first year
Yeah.
psychology student who shows up, regularly for every iteration of the study. Those studies drive me crazy because they're
Yeah.
so limited, and then we publish that material as if somehow it speaks to all people around the world.
Yeah,
So
it's universal, right? Right.
but my studies have kind of gone the opposite direction. Most of the work I do is actually with populations who are under incredible stress in places like right now we're doing a big study of young people in oil and gas towns that are going through
Mm.
this incredible roller coaster of oil and gas prices being so deflated, and towns that haven't necessarily diversified their economies, basically looking at their, needing to practically completely shut down. Now I'm not, I'm certainly not I'm not an apologist for the industry or anything like that. But what I am concerned by is, where are these young people going to go, and especially under that kind of stress. And we're also doing that kind of same research in other places like South Africa, where you have vast numbers of people, young people living with very little hope in the townships, also around one industry towns, and looking at how they kind of cope. So when you begin to look at people under a lot of stress globally, then you frankly find different things that are predicting that they'll do well. And while, yes, positive attitude, the way you attribute what happens to you, do you blame yourself? Do you blame others? These are all themes in that work for sure. But as we know, having enough food to eat, and whether or not you have a government in place and a healthcare system, and whether or not you treat it fairly or prejudiced against, these things take on a very big and more meaningful part of a person's life the moment we introduce the idea of that you're on the fringes. If I mean, you send your kid to school and they say, well, you're being bullied, but don't, just think positively and, just believe in yourself. Well, that's great until lunch hour comes and the kid is walloped
Yeah.
by, a couple of very large grade sixes or something. And of course, what we actually know, if you look at those studies, say, of, the Deborah Peplar and Wendy Craig and others who are leading scholars in the area of bullying, they acknowledge that most of what gets a kid through a bullying episode and prevents sort of, the traumatic sequelae afterwards are the fact that the child has one friend, one other person.
Yeah.
Bonding with that kid will basically make that kid much more, almost like a shield against the bully, because the bullies don't like when two, they like one. And so you
Right.
begin to think about it's got to be a combination. I don't want to completely write off that all the science of our that we've proven that cognitive distortions change our everything from our susceptibility to pain medication to right up through our ability to to persist through stress or persevere. I don't want to take away from that, but
Right.
I don't think the conversation is complete when that's all it's about.
Well, yeah, because we'll get into this in more depth, but one of the major themes throughout the book is your differentiation between the rugged individual versus the resourced individual, and so that you make the point that success depends on our ability to change the world around us far more than our ability to change ourselves, and that comes up in every chapter in your book. Uh, And what I did really enjoy about the book, and you note very early on that we have a host of problems: obesity, chronic health problems, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. They're all on the rise. Our mental health crisis, the toll of stress that's taken on employees, and yet you mentioned that we're bombarded by the self help industry and the messages that admonish us to that change comes from within. Happiness is a skill. These are the tropes. We need to retrain our brains. We need to change ourselves. And but the trends seem to be getting worse. So what's going on here? We got all this self help books everywhere, and workshops and courses,
Yeah.
uh, and that's what I really appreciated about your book.
Does seem to be a bit of a paradox because not to take away from proper good mindfulness based training or the need for our children to learn self regulation skills, but it is odd that for all of our all the yoga mats being sold, it's kind of like, hey, something's not catching here. And I think the problem with this has been, as near as I can figure, the problem has been that we're doing self help with the emphasis too much on the self, and we're not thinking enough
Yeah,
about we're just not thinking enough about the world around us. So, there are studies, say for instance, of juvenile delinquents in the 1930s. There's a very long multi-year study that was done by a couple of Harvard professors, and they picked up a data set that was put together by a husband and wife couple in the 1930s. And then, they looked at basically 500 kind of delinquent young men in the justice system in the 30s. And these two Harvard professors picked up the same data set. John Lobb and Robert Sampson, they picked up the same data set when these young men had grown up to be in their 70s. And the fascinating part of that was, well, sort of what changed them. The ones that didn't tumble into endless, drugs, crime, years of delinquency. What changed them? And what they found were there were experiences along the way, which of course would have had a profound impact on their how they were thinking. But the idea that these men developed things like self-regulation skills or better capacity to make social relationships, a lot of it was tied to, in fact, there was high predictability if these young men had ended up in, say, for instance, the military, which, I mean, without getting into the debate about, if that should be a positive developmental pathway or not, the point is that it provided structure, a powerful identity, and meaning in a culture that really valued them for their contribution. It also, and then the other big one, which I find kind of funny, is they also, quote unquote, married well. Now, there's, of course, a heteronormative bias in this. And of course, it was all young men. It was nobody interviewed the women that these young men had to live with to see if they particularly appreciated raising a delinquent boy into maturity and responsibility, all those kinds of other questions we can ignore for a second. But the point is that, there were some external cues that made it possible for these young fellows to learn the necessary social and emotional skills that they needed, as well as the self-regulation that they needed to get through life and become contributing members of their societies. And so I'm kind of like, when we start only with the individual responsibility, or we responsibilize our own individual sense of, that this is all on my shoulders to change and cope, I think sometimes we blame people for not getting through really tough times, when in fact it's kind of like, I think there's a bit of a shared responsibility here between the world around us and our own engagement, or what we do to take advantage of the resources that are there for us.
yeah, and I think yes, that's right. The idea of self blame or victim blaming, and that's really what's insidious, I think, about some aspects of the self help industry and how it makes us feel bad about ourselves. You also talk about you tell a story, the problem of the Cinderella story. I'd like you to explain that in a minute. But when I read it, immediately what came to mind for me was Oprah Winfrey. who seems to be almost like a neoliberal icon of the Cinderella story. Could
Mhm.
you explain the relevance of this story?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I'll do presentations to large groups of people, and months later they'll come back and they don't remember anything except the Cinderella story. It's kind of like, it's a great, it's like, hey, look, why not, right? The Cinderella story. Look, if you think about it, the story is always told from the point of view of Cinderella as this super resilient kid. Her mother dies, then her father dies, and she's left with the evil stepmom. And stepmoms always get as I say, a bad rap in these stories. And then she has this kind of goodness of heart and goodness of personality. And she has a fairy godmother, and the fairy godmother turns a pumpkin into a golden carriage, and she's whisked off to the ball, and she enchants the prince with her wonderful personality, and she has the right shoe size for the glass slipper, and the story goes on and on and on, and of course she wins the heart of the prince, and it lives happily ever after. Okay, so again, we can, if we think about, there's all kinds of problems with that story from a lot of anyway, but I mean, the biggest problem that I have with the story is that it puts all the responsibility for the change on Cinderella's shoulders. And when in fact, if you think about it, the story is not actually about Cinderella. It's about the value of having a fairy godmother. Because without the
Mm-hmm.
fairy godmother in the story, there is no happy ending. Take the fairy godmother out, and what you have is an abused, neglected child working away, toiling away in the basement of a home, doesn't provide her education. There's no social welfare state in this magical kingdom. The prince spends all his money on gala balls for the rich and famous and never thinking about any sort of social safety net. There's not one mention of that in the story at all. No social workers ever mentioned in the Cinderella story. Anyways, and you keep going on with it until you realize that without the fairy godmother there, this kid grows up and she's like a lot of the kids that I've worked with over the decades of my clinical practice. She would tell her fairy, her stepmother, basically, screw you, I'm out of here. And she would run away and end up behind the palace, hungry, tired, probably swapping sex for a place to sleep at night. And the story would go from there towards a child who's possibly trafficked, drug addicted, and everything else. And that is the story that was most likely to happen because the fairy godmother was not there. So what I'm
Right.
wanting to say to us is, while yes, you do have to take advantage of your fairy godmother when she appears, right? You can't kind of tell her to bugger off. Um, but you do have to still have fairy godmothers showing up occasionally in our lives, and and we often see that through our healthcare systems, our inaccessibility. There's some fascinating studies of children, say, with physical disabilities. And what they've shown is in concentric circles, the further a child with a physical or disability lives from a hospital or for treatment, the less treatment that child gets. So it's as much as we think there's a equitable access or something, or we say, well, there's treatment there, the child can heal. Well, that's actually not entirely true. No matter how much that child believes in themselves or wants to be healthy, um, that grit, if you like, will certainly maybe help them take advantage of that. But ultimately, we also know that the further they are away from services, and indeed the more facilitating their parent is, the more likely they are to actually succeed. So the science of Cinderella, Cinderella is a comical little way of showing it, but it really is borne out as well by the science when you actually look at the studies, which kind of say, um, children with fairy godmothers do much better also, no matter what their medical conditions are as well.
Well, I think that brings up a really good topic, and I think we could talk about perhaps the relationship between stress and resilience. And I know from among the mindfulness advocates that stress seems to be the big boogeyman, and stress has been viewed as all inside one's head. They subscribe, well, many subscribe to a very privatized view of stress. But from your research, you found that all stress is not created equal, and that stress is not necessarily a bad thing or a problem that needs to be fixed. Can you say more about that?
Well, yeah, and Ron, I'm really glad you mentioned your own work in terms of mindfulness, because of course, I mean, that kind of the real spiritual traditions under mindfulness based practice was never to sort of become a completely neutral being that never had any experience of stress or never. I think sometimes you get the sense sometimes people are trying to reach to some sort of enlightened state of non attachment that is so decontextualized that I think it's a bit of a misinterpretation from really. Obviously, I love your work because it says we do have to. It's not a light practice. It's supposed to be more substantial, and in some sense, you're linking back to what I'm also finding in the research on stress and trauma, is that we there's a big difference between the quality of the stress that you're experienced and the quantity of it. So if I might, one of the things is we don't actually want children or adults experiencing stress-free lives. That's a formula for almost like some sort of weird dissociation or detachment from. I mean, you want people experiencing manageable amounts of stress to bring out their best selves. And the emphasis often on manageable, so that when you're experiencing a stress, what's ideal is that you have the resources, personal and social, external, to cope with that stress. It's more toxic, of course, when you're in a situation that you feel trapped and not unable to cope. But what researchers like Michael Rudder and others have certainly proven and shown, and indeed in a bit of my own work as well, is that um, when you're exposed to the right amount of stress and you have the right resources to handle it, there is a stealing, STEEL, stealing effect on your experience, which makes it easier for you to cope with what you've experienced. Right? It kind of
Yeah.
prepares you, like a vaccine, like an inoculation um,
Yeah.
for the future.
Yes, it's just the right amount of stress can help you succeed.
Well, exactly, right. I mean, I think that even I mean, there's there's always that notion of you wanting to. You don't want to be completely devoid of stress. You don't want to live in such an under. You don't want to have no experiences of the world. You want to experience those things, I think, and then I think what I perceive as a healthy response is one that embraces that, learns from that, develops the skill set you need to cope, and then copes with increasing amounts of stress as you get older, rather than being what sometimes is talked about as children who are orchids, who are the orchid flower is it's a lovely flower, it's very beautiful, and it is really fragile, right? It
Yeah.
is. It just doesn't survive very well at all in any
And
kind of.
you mentioned toxic stress. Uh, well, how's that different, and how would you describe that?
Well, toxic stress tends to be a very negative stress that is not controllable and for which you don't have the resources to respond. Probably the most typical use of the term is things like in a work environment where you have you need the money, you have a mortgage, you have a car payment, you're going to a job, and your boss or a coworker is consistently treating you very poorly, or
Hmm.
making unreasonable demands on you or harassing you. That's a great example of toxic stress. It's that stress that just turns your guts, produces the ulcers. It's coupled between it's that stress that's coupled with a total sense of helplessness and a lack of control over your situation. Um, and it tends to permeate our lives on multiple, not just at the work environment, but at home, because of course you can't change it. I think that's quite different than, say, a company that's ramping up production because suddenly there's an opportunity, and they're saying to all their employees, we're a team. We've been working throughout this
Right.
years. We're going to work an extra, we're going to all work 12-hour shifts. We're going to get these products out because this is what we've been aiming for, and we're going to pay you a bonus at the end. You're going to be under tremendous stress. Your relationship at home is going to go a little wonky. Your kids are going to not know you. But at the end of the day, this is something you've trained for. You could do it, and there's a sense of optimism about the future and control.
Yeah, well, that raises a really good point because you know how critical I am of corporate mindfulness programs, and I think about this for people or employees that are subjected to toxic stress in the workplace, and when they're given an intervention, individualistic intervention, they may recover temporarily from the workplace stressors, whatever they may be, but then they have to go right back to the same toxic environment that hasn't significantly changed. They have to adapt and adjust to what may be very intolerable conditions. So I think that raises the point that you bring up is, and the question is why are collective resources so important then for weathering a crisis or getting through adversity?
Yeah, that's a very good point, especially in the work environment. It's funny, Ron. I'm sure maybe you've experienced this too, but I'll sometimes get invited to enter a corporate setting that's under a lot of stress from, well, it could be a merger, it could just be whatever situation has happened to them, and I usually on the first phone call, the one, you do know I'm not going to just talk about the workers adapting to a bad environment, right? Like, let's be real.
Yeah,
If
right.
if that's the talk you want, I really don't recommend me. Because I'm going to come in and say you need to be rugged. You do need to buck up a little bit and be able to have the some of the self-regulation, the mindfulness training. You do need a sense of not to catastrophize your situation. You do need those skills, those cognitive skills, absolutely. But you also need management and structures and workplaces and workstations and physical environments in a sense accommodate to you as well. And therefore it's really good for the organization to do some sort of appreciative inquiry to say, well, what have we done in this particular work environment that has successfully helped our employees to cope with more and more stress. And interestingly, I think you're probably more versed than myself on this in terms of it's not always financial incentives that people are looking for that help them deal with stress. It's actually
Mhm.
much more likely to be everything from the placement of their workstation to their social relationships at work and the meaningfulness or the meaning that they derive from their actual employment. That those things are often great buffers against the toxicity of a workplace environment. Um, and I think sometimes but that can actually be given to people. It's not just a matter of the worker saying, well, I'm going to find meaning in my job. Well, no, it's also about a workplace that gives a message that, here's, do you understand how your cog in the machine is actually producing something that's a benefit to everybody? And I think that's really about good leadership, good management. Um, some of the better books like Leaders Eat Last and all this kind of stuff, they certainly get into that idea of it is about good leadership. um, I also I do think our workstations matter. I think if you're in fact I was just reading something recently on as we kind of take down the cubicles in many workplaces, that's great for some, but if you're an introvert it's a really
Yeah,
hellish
yeah,
there's some of us who are a little more introverted that my ultimate fear has been that I would end up in an open office space all the time. I like people, I just don't like them that much.
yeah. Well, same here. Um,
So yeah.
I wonder if you've been thinking about because you talk about. Well, you make the point in this particular chapter. Let's see, I think it is chapter 2, the many ways we cope. You make a point that recovery is a misnomer, but I'm wondering if you're thinking, given what's happening with COVID-19, about recovery from job loss, because that's obviously going to be a big point.
Yeah.
It seems like it's going to be a very important issue for millions of people that have lost their jobs or been displaced.
Well, this, I must
Uh,
say, if ever there was a lesson in resilience and the argument that's made in Change Your World, which is it's about the external environment, it is COVID. It is basically what we're seeing right now. This is not about any individual's um, capacity to, make their own way in the world. This is about our collective resistance and our collective ability to cope. And certainly when people go back to work, and they will, I think this idea of recovery, of course, is what I was trying to say in the book is that, and what the science of resilience says is you don't just simply go back to a normative functioning however you were basically coping before. The science, very clearly, we know that as you've come through these harsh experiences, you're learning a new skill set, or indeed your environment is being adapted to accommodate those external stressors as well, which is basically saying that the workplace that you're going to go back to is going to be transformed, hopefully for the better, maybe a little bit more resilient itself as a setting. And hopefully the people going back are going to have learned a new set of capacities and coping skills as well. I think, and a couple of very concrete examples of that, of course, are around everything from e-learning. I think what we're seeing is people, I heard one group that I work with was telling me that, they've been trying to get, the IT department of this NGO have been trying to get all their people to use an e-learning platform and a communication platform. And a lot of the fellow people who were sort of maybe had been at the organization for more than 20 years were really resistant to doing so. It just wasn't how they did. Suddenly, they're all literally within 5 days, every single person was properly trained and using both the e-learning and the electronic communication internal networks, all the web-based services within the organization. Because they had to go home, they had to isolate and social distance. And so what I'm imagining what's going to happen is that there's going to be a huge uptake of these technologies. And this is going to change our social relationships with people, hopefully for the better. But it's also going to change our interactions with our environment. Who knows, maybe this will actually get us to drive our cars less and those kinds of things. We could see a systemic change. And that's what I write a lot about, of course, is that resilience is, the idea that as you change the resilience of one system, whether that's your gut bacteria or your political system, to be more mindful, more caring of it, people, or whatever, each of those systemic changes ripples through other systems. So, if you change what you eat, you tend to have a better immune system. That immune system makes you more resistant to certain diseases, etc., and potentially mental illnesses like anxiety and depression as well. So those links are beginning to get made. But also, if you think about it, the other side, we can think about as you change the world around us through this whole COVID-19 pandemic, is we're understanding that as governments, the governments that responded best, that had the systems in place to meet the needs of their people, were the ones that actually weathered this with the least painful outcomes. So there was, there's an interesting conversation here about which political systems work best in which context, and how we get our needs met. So I do think when we go back to work, essentially come back to your question, Ron, when we come back to work, it's going to be a changed world, but also I think we're going to have been changed as well. And hopefully, for the better, maybe we're going to see new opportunities.
Yeah, that does raise a lot of points. I've also been thinking about how COVID-19 and the political system, or the lack thereof, has exposed the cracks that have always been there, just how severe they are and how people are falling through the cracks. So, I've been toying with, let's not go back to abnormal, because maybe what we had was abnormal. And we could see it glaringly now, given what's happening. I was really happy to see that you also are not, I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but you're not a big fan of Eckhart Tolle. I've been a critic of his writings going way back, and his New Age oversimplifications. But you bring up the story of the beggar, which comes right out of his book, The Power Now. Story of the beggar, is that we have everything we need inside of us if only we would look. It's such a naive and I would say even cruel statement. But you see this, among New Age people, mindfulness movement, the wellness industry. it seems like they all have the equation wrong because your work seems to be saying that we need to think much more about changing our environments, changing ourselves. And I think that brings up the question is, and maybe we've already touched on it, is the role and significance of context and how that modulates or mitigates how we deal with stress.
Yes, exactly. I think what it's funny. I get some pushback sometimes because people say, "Well, you can't change the world. All you can change is yourself." Well,
Yeah.
that's not entirely true because actually you can do a lot to change the world. You can put yourself. I mean, you do have to take some personal exercise, some personal agency in this for sure. I mean, I'm not completely writing that off, but like the example I'll give is something as simple as before you sign up for the yoga class after work or on your lunch hour, ask your spouse, your partner, if you have kids, ask them to pick up the slack. It's a funny one, but do you ever meet the people who are really stressed out doing yoga classes? It's kind of, and I can relate to this a little bit because when I try and my kids thankfully are now older, but when they were younger, it was like literally dashing to the gym to get some exercise so I would be healthier, and then dashing out of the gym and going picking up the kids and getting them home and doing the dinner routines and everything else, and and part of, as much as I did try to do a bit of this, it was challenging. But of course, the real solution is to turn to your spouse, if you have a spouse, if that's in your situation, and say, can we figure out something here so we both get some time to exercise or go to yoga classes or do whatever it is that is part of our emotional and spiritual well-being. But can we make sure the world around us is giving us that flexibility so that we can actually be better at this. We can choose to live where we don't have to drive as much, perhaps. We can make choices where if we do have to drive, we can make choices where we park our car and how far from the door of our business so that we get some more steps in. We can certainly make choices around food and some of those kinds of things if we have the money, of course, to buy healthy. If we have the money to buy healthy food. So there are definitely choices that we can make that we can take some responsibility for that within our power, especially if we can get the world around us to adapt a little bit. Like, for instance, if you're in a toxic work environment, which going back to a conversation we just had, Ron, people sometimes can get away from a toxic boss and still remain in the same job by asking for a lateral move, a reassignment to a special project. They can, band together with their other employees. And of course, if they're a unionized shop, maybe they have a shop steward that they can actually get to advocate for them. But sometimes I think people, if you come into a situation, the worker says, well, all you have to do is just simply take a deep breath and calm yourself and just suck it up. I'm not sure that's the most helpful advice.
Yeah. Well, one of the most interesting chapters for me is chapter 4 in your book, The Problems with Positive Thinking. And I'd like to really dig into this. It's you start out the chapter with telling a story. I guess you were at a conference or at a TED Talk, I'm not real sure, of Todd Sampson,
Yeah.
who I believe climbed Mount Everest, if I recall.
Mm-hmm.
But that you also shared the stage with Todd, not just Todd Sampson, but also John Kabat-Zinn, who is the father of the mindfulness movement, so to speak, and pioneer of mindfulness-based stress reduction. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? And then I'd like to dig in to some of the problems with the research associated with mindfulness-based stress reduction.
Yeah, sure. So I did have a chance to, I was at the same event presenting, but so as John Kabat-Zinn, and heard him speak to, it was a very large group, and I heard him make this this quote, right? You can't change, what is it? You can't change your life, but you can't. I'm losing it. You can't change the waves, but you can learn to surf, or something like.
Learn to surf. Yeah, that's a famous.
Yeah,
yeah.
And he's right to some extent. To honor it. There is an element of making proper attributions and not making sure you exercise some locus of control, and all these kinds of ideas that have been around for a while. But of course, as I also say in Change Your World, I said, it's also a lot easier to learn to surf if you have a lifeguard, a coach, and a surfboard. So, that's the part.
Yeah, and surf lessons.
Yeah,
right.
it might not be bad to get a little bit of support. And Todd Sampson does all these mind hack things where he trains his mind to basically take on incredible challenges. And to tip my hat to Todd, it's kind of fascinating to watch. He does the Houdini trick where he goes underwater for 2 minutes and undoes all these chains with these complicated combination locks and everything else, and he doesn't drown and he survives. It's great. But as I say, I mean, it took him many tries till he survived that. And when he went, before he goes underwater, a dive team go under with him to haul his, they haul his ass out every time he every time he doesn't do it, he gets hauled back to the surface. And he trains with incredible people who are his coaches, and he has lots of money to do the trainings. And I mean, there's an element here of we sometimes forget.
Yeah, there's a lot beneath the iceberg, so to speak.
There is a lot, and I think I wish sometimes that people who presented mindfulness-based strategies, kind of before they sold it too much, would tell their audience, by the way, make sure you're not being abused, make sure you're not being exploited, make sure you have a safe place to be, make sure other people are going to help cook some meals while you're getting on along with your path. I'll give you a small, very, very concretely, in terms of, we're in this middle of this COVID-19, the rates of child abuse and domestic violence have got to be going through the roof as people are shuttered in highly stressed environments. And this is, no amount of positive thinking in a pandemic is going to get you through those kinds of situations. So while it's true that positive thinking, if you look at some of the work by gerontologists who've looked at, say, longevity, they've shown quite clearly that some of the leading people on this that if people who have a very positive orientation towards aging, as they get into their 80s, especially, it's the life they can extend their life expectancy by, say, something like over 7 years, based on just their positive attitude towards aging. And that's equivalent to having never smoked or not having had diabetes. Now, I actually believe those statistics, because I do think that there's something about that. But there's also an element of it won't help you any if you don't have adequate health care, or even more profoundly, something as simple as a sidewalk outside your apartment building to go for a walk. No amount of positive thinking, if you're shut in a dangerous environment without adequate health care, is going to extend your life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm coming at this from. Yeah.
Yeah, and in this particular chapter, I really like how you point out in the beginning that when you talk about Buddhist monks, if we look at Buddhist monks that have devoted their almost entire life to meditation, completely devoted, but they were also dependent on community support.
Yeah.
They couldn't pull this off without the support of the community. But the image we often have is that these monks are just off on their own in a cave and doing it all on their own and everything. And I think that's a similar analogy to Todd Sampson. But you really bring up some good points about the research on mindfulness-based interventions. I'm wondering if we could take a closer look at that.
Yeah, sure.
One of the points you bring up is that, I hear this a lot too, is we hear that, MBSR or mindfulness-based interventions work, but the studies don't really tell us whom they work for, all the background factors. That's one of the points you bring up, right?
That's interesting you bring that. Yeah, we've some of my newest work, actually, I'm working with Dr. Raquel Noguera from Spain right now. And what we're actually doing is we reviewed literally dozens and dozens of intervention studies using mindfulness or meditation or these kinds of techniques with children to look at what the long-term and potential benefits are. And to be fair, to be completely balanced and truthful, there is actually overall a small to medium effect size when these interventions are well done in people's lives. They interestingly have a much bigger effect. So most of the changes accounted for on if you take children who need to change something physical, like an elevated heart rate or their panic attacks, or where you're actually looking at the impact on, say, their ability to sort of self-regulate something that's metabolic. There's more impact of a mindfulness-based strategy. When you're just looking at changes of thinking patterns or a relation to anxiety or depression, the effect size shrinks. And what's particularly disappointing about this, and unfortunate, is that it actually, for children with very little stress in their lives, it does actually very little long term for them. And in fact, most of the benefits for any child drops off once they stop using the technique. So the moment they hit summer vacation, you can expect very little of that training to sort of inform how well they function after the workshop or the intensity of the intervention actually ends. And that's kind of a good news, bad news story, if you will. So the other thing which we find is I've been going, so with Dr. Ungar, we've been kind of looking at the data and saying, well, which population at what stress level does this actually work best for? And interestingly, it actually seems to work. The biggest effect seems to be with people who are under the most stress. Now, that's if they participate in the interventions. So what I'm actually thinking might be happening there is that when you frankly, if you took a population that's really, they're having a really crappy life, and you come in with something like this, it is still value added. Someone is paying attention to them. Someone is giving them some coping strategies in a world that they might not be able to do anything other than adapt to. If you're living in dire poverty, one of your parents is struggling with an addictions, there's violence in the home or gun violence in your community, or maybe you're, whatever, and you come in with an intervention, then at least you're offering the child something with and that's going to have some positive impact in their life. And I like that. I mean, I think that's good. You might also offer a nice child welfare intervention too. And I think there's very, very few studies which have said, okay, let's go, A is the mindfulness, B is the social intervention, and let's give a kid A, let's give B, and now let's give a kid A plus B and see what the cumulative changes. And what we kind of are thinking, though it's not really being done extensively, is that A plus B is far better than just A alone.
Yeah, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense. You also point out that just the importance, the role of personal agency is. Could you talk more about that?
Well, yeah, I mean,
and control, I think, is another.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of a colleague of mine from Germany, Raphael Kalesch, that runs a resilience research lab over there. I mean, he's very strongly an advocate that how we attribute our experience, like whether or not we see our experiences as under our control or sense of self-efficacy, whether or not we blame ourselves or blame others, kind of filter our experiences and lead to a change in everything from the way we think about the world to our physical health, our mental health, and indeed our functioning. So whether or not we abuse drugs or stay in our jobs, everything. And I don't disagree with Raphael, but I do sometimes challenge him a little bit to say, we're still talking about external worlds influencing our sense of control. So one of my very earliest studies, when you asked me at the beginning of this interview about whether or not I was interested in how I got interested in resilience studies, and one of my very, very first studies was of kids receiving mental health services. And I was interested not in resilience, I was interested in their experiences of empowerment. It was all the empowerment, the buzzword of the day, I guess, or something. And what I'd found was that working with these kids who all had sort of severe mental health challenges, and other complexities in their life, other comorbidities, that they actually, the ones who said to me, I have a sense of control, or I can control something in my life, I actually am going to do better. They were the ones that seemed to avoid all the perils and pitfalls of their situation. So they resisted tumbling into drugs, or even if they had a mental illness or were incredibly stressed by something, they seemed to recover much faster. But that recovery also was somewhat dependent on whether or not the world around them accommodated to them. So, I mean, a very simple, kind of a crazy example: a 12-year-old kid whose mother was just violent. Like, he told one of the incidents of him being chased around his small apartment by her as she took a knife. She was literally waving a knife at him, trying to gut him. I mean, this is how severe things had become. And interesting, he had accommodated to that by spending more time in school, getting involved in extracurricular activities. He had some teachers that really looked after him. And the child welfare was coming into the situation and threatening to take him away from the mother. Now, the problem with that would have been that this boy said, I really don't want to be disrupted. I like my school. I like my community. I kind of love my mother, even though she's a bit crazy. I don't really want to go into the child welfare system. And it was a very interesting problem to solve as I, worked with the boy. And at one point he says to me, I said to him, aren't you worried about your mother, threatening you with a knife? Aren't you worried? And he says, this guy was a real jock. He was a sports star at his school and everything else. And his mother, to be fair, was very out of shape, really very, very, very ill that way. Anyways, and he says, Mike, you've met my mother? I said, yeah. Mike, she can't catch me. So, you kind of like, okay, I'm kind of worried about you still, kiddo. And we're going to monitor the situation really closely. But it was that moment of saying, look, he was telling me that I have control in this situation. I decide when I go home at night. I decide what sport activities. I have people I know I'm connected to. I've got this. If you put me in a foster care system, I lose all say over my life. And that, for me, might be more damaging to my mental well-being and my behavior than what I currently live. Now, that's a tough call when you got someone waving a knife at a kid. Like, I'm not trying to celebrate this, right? But I am saying that there was two sides to that story. And then what we, of course, did was we put in huge amounts of interventions with the mother and monitored the situation really closely. So the state, in a sense, took control of the family situation as well to protect the boy. But it's amazing when you give kids some say over their situation. I've learned over and over again, they tend to do much better.
Yeah, and I think you clarify in the book that, as we've just been talking about, is that we tend to think that control or agency is all inside us, but I think what your research is showing that it's also a function of the resources available to us, just like in the story you just mentioned.
Yes, exactly. That's it.
And also, you note how easily control can be taken away from us. And again, what I'm thinking of the shelter-in-place orders, the stay-at-home orders that we have right now. The economy is, crumbling. And so there are times that you mentioned, maybe this is an exact quote, something like, there are times, of course, when we cannot change the world around us, and the only thing left for us to do is to change our thinking. Is that where we're at right now with being shelter in place?
That's a great example of that. That sometimes I talk in the book about 4 strategies. Of course, you can try and change yourself, right? You could, meditate more and not do anything to support yourself. You can try and find resources around you, and I talk about a dozen different resources that people go look for. Or you can kind of generate new resources, or let's face it, there are people. And we saw this with, some of the famous tales of people who survived the Holocaust, et cetera, that sometimes you're in just genocidal, absolutely awful situations where you have zero power to change. And the only thing left for you in those situations is to change your mindset to survive. And that does make sense to me, but it's not a great strategy for a population's surviving. So while here we are, we're all in sort of social distancing, we're on shelter inside orders and this type of thing globally. And a lot of people are on the one hand, it is about changing your cognitions and keeping positive and stuff like that. But actually, what's also helpful to people is everything from imposing structure on yourself. So,
Yeah.
setting an alarm in the morning, not oversleeping. Um, and I'm also seeing people not forget that they have to think about everything from their culture. When I see Italians on their balconies singing the national anthem or a famous Italian show tune that's just lifts everyone's spirits, it's about the collective, and it's also about one's adhering to one's culture. It's about having an external cue that says there's still other parts of your life are still vibrant. There's hope for the future. These are all things that are given to us. And we know this from studies of post tsunami, post wildfires. When people's lives are stabilized and put back into routines, that they tend to do much better. So on the one hand, you can talk about, yes, we have lost all control. Our government has, in a sense, we've have a social contract. We've said, please take our control away from us so we avoid death here. This makes some sense. I think people are slowly buying into it, or they are now buying into it a great deal. And that's, but even there, if you think about it, Ron, isn't it? There is still an element of control in giving up your control in a pandemic situation.
Yeah.
And I think the people who seem to be struggling most with this are the ones who have been somehow manipulated to believe that this is not real, that this is some deep state conspiracy or something foolish like that, as if or that somehow, or they have an attribution that some higher power God is going to somehow get them through the pandemic unscathed. I mean, these are, I think, people who, in a sense, they aren't willing to give up that control yet because they have some other secret belief that is their source of power. And I don't know if that any of those belief systems are going to protect you when someone sneezes on you. But if it's kind of amazing that people will adhere to beliefs and they feel like they're in total control when they forget that actually their control is dependent on herd immunity. Essentially, is what's going to happen here. They'll only survive this if everyone else adheres to the rules. And then, in a sense, their survival is caught up in the world around them, doing exactly what it needs to do to make sure everyone does okay.
Yeah, that's very good. I'd like to bring up another story I really enjoyed in the book. You talk about when you were in Russia, of attending the Russian ballet, and just how often the ballet dancers and the performers interrupted the performance to take bows. The numerous curtain calls and standing ovations, and that was somewhat odd to you, right? To see that.
It really was. It was just an oddest thing because in the middle of the ballet, they would take bows if they did something amazing, which is they were amazing dancers. And at the end, I actually counted them. And I swear that there were 12 curtain calls at the end. The audience had thinned out to a quarter of what was there at the beginning, but they were still coming out doing curtain calls. And I got to tell you, Ron, it's like I thought about it afterwards. And it just struck me, well, dancers really know how to create an appreciative audience for themselves. And yet so many other people, I'm a social worker and family therapist by training. And I got to tell you, we don't do it, right? There's, I often joke, we don't come out of our office after a great interview with a family that's gone in crisis or something and take a bow in front of everyone and say, I just had an amazing interview or something. We don't do enough of that. And my acknowledgement of that is that when we provoke our environments to give us more of what we need, and I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about a powerful identity. I'm talking about relationships. I can give you a much more simpler and mundane example. I mean, ballet dancers are so unattainable. Wow, they seek out praise. But on a very small level, I would say, for instance, that if many businesses have what I call the birthday person. That person in the work team that remembers everyone else's birthday and brings in, I don't know, a cake or whatever it is that you're allowed to do, right? And I love those people because what they've done is they've provoked from the environment around them that said, okay, maybe my job is kind of meaningless, or they perceive it that way, but I'm going to be the glue that holds this team together. I'm going to find a powerful identity, and I'm going to provoke from others recognition. I'm going to do my curtain call by bringing in a cake and saying, you and everyone around you matter to me. And maybe that affection, that mattering will be reciprocated back to the person bringing in the cake. And in a sense, that's the dynamic, isn't it, of asking of our environments to honor us.
Yeah, you even say, and I mean, this is kind of prophetic in a way. In the book, you say, "I tell my colleagues that healthcare workers should act more like Russian dancers and being our best selves and bringing out our best selves, avoiding burnout requires recognition. And, obviously, in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis and the crisis of our healthcare system, it, there's a lot of attention being brought now to just the heroic efforts of the media coverage of healthcare workers. Do you think this is helping them in a way, like
Oh,
bringing that appreciative audience?
undoubtedly. I mean, I think that you can't, that people will, be their best and boldest selves by having, and there's an interesting constellation. I think sometimes forget that it's not that recognition triggers a cascade of protective mechanisms or factors in our lives. So the recognition also triggers a powerful identity. Our identity is somewhat, as we say, a co-construction. That notion of that others see me the way I want to be seen, and I reflect and internalize what others see. But it's also about relationship building. It's about feeling in power and control. It's about meaning in life. These acknowledgments of our medical professionals during this period, I think, are really profound in terms of giving them a sense that their contribution is meaningful and necessary, and that I think that encourages people to give that extra bit at a time of great need. And what's really tragic is that we will actually have deaths amongst our healthcare professionals who are serving selflessly. Because they are on the front lines of this. And, I think that is that's a huge and tragic consequence of this. So definitely the resilience, if you're thinking about resilience, we're also thinking about the systems, not just the resilience of the individual nurse, going in and working hard. It's not just about his or her thinking. It's also about whether or not the systems of supply management get that person the protective gear that they need to feel, one, that they feel valued, two, that they have what they need to actually survive the crisis. And so we sometimes, it's not just about them thinking, oh, I'm going to get through this. It's also about whether or not decisions are made by politicians to early enough anticipate listen to the scientists and basically get the supplies in place that are going to be necessary to make your staff more resilient to a crisis. And this kind of complex thinking that I'm really trying to get people to think about.
Yeah, and you make really good points about that in one of your chapters, chapter 7, The Institutions We Need But Seldom Get. That's exactly what you talk about, how complex problems need complex solutions that affect these multiple systems, and nurture trumps nature every time. That's a point you make, and that resilience is political. And it seems like what we're seeing in the United States especially is just this misplaced faith in individualism. And how it's, I think this is probably one of the underlying insights from your book is that, with the example with Todd Sampson that we talked about, that these larger contextual or institutional supports are often invisible. But in a way, when we're touting self-help, and we're looking at people like Todd Sampson,
Yeah.
that's kind of a huge blind spot, right? We seem to have this amazing blind spot at least in North America, more so in the United States.
Well, I certainly, as I will jokingly say, or not so jokingly say, I love meat inspectors. Talk about a hidden resilience resource that we all benefit from. Unless you're a vegan or vegetarian,
I think those regulations have been loosened up under the Trump administration.
It's a funny one, but I mean, and this, so basically, yeah, we all had this wonderful virtual dinner together, and supported the well-being of one of the families on the street. And my point is that those systems were in place before the pandemic, right? That when we needed our neighbors, and we've all been shopping for each other, and we've all been checking on. There's a couple of elderly people on the street, and we're all be making sure that they're okay. And all those systems were in place, and they weren't undermined before the crisis happened. And then this is what resilience is about. Resilience, and resilience and positive psychology differ in this. We're not talking about a general sense of traits. What we're talking about is what gets you through a crisis, and that is really what the science of resilience studies. So having these strong institutions or systems in place before the crisis is actually what gets you through the crisis. And that's kind of what I'm learning in whatever I'm studying in whichever community is part of the studies that we're doing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'll be looking forward to some of your future publications, especially if you ever go down the road of looking more closely at the science of career resilience, and especially given what we're anticipating in terms of the unemployment rate that's going to skyrocket over the next year or so. And
absolutely,
I won't dwell on this, but you do address this. It's a very complex subject, and I think you mentioned it in terms of the great disruption with the advent of robotics and AI, artificial intelligence, coming on the scene very rapidly. And what I found interesting is that you note that the measure of workplace resilience may actually be those that are gainfully unemployed, which may come as a shock to some people, to most people. Do you know where I'm going with that?
Absolutely. There is an interesting idea that if you look at some of what the futurists are saying, is that imagine a world where it's a sign of a badly functioning society when you say, we've got a 40% employment rate, because the more unemployed, the more successful our society is, the more we've got artificial intelligence and robotics working for us. Yeah. And therefore, to have a high employment rate is actually a sign of a society that is actually failing.
Well, it's about time, because we've been hearing that for 50 years about labor-saving devices, right?
I don't think it's happening. I don't think it's causing any change. Well, but then, of course, the question is two things. One, how do you have an economy? How do you transfer income to people who are not laboring? And then what's equitable? I mean, this raises a huge number of questions in terms of reorganizing society like that. But these are questions that are coming very quickly, and how we'll displace people, how we're going to displace people. It's all going to be It's going to be a very interesting.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of writings I haven't really been following about the post-work society and things like that. Universal basic income, of course, has been a topic of interest lately. All these things kind of are coming to the fore.
Exactly.
Well, Michael, I think we've had an amazing conversation. I learned a lot from your book. I really did. I took copious notes, and I highly recommend people to get your book, Change Your World. And again, thank you for your time and generosity for being on the program.
No, well, Ron, it's an honor too, because your own work has sort of inspired. I love the fact that you've taken such a careful and measured look at what has become unfortunately sort of watered down or a popularized notion of mindfulness, and it's removing what it really was meant to be. So it's an honor to. There's such a nice synergy between the work, but it's great to connect. So all the best to you, and of course those listening.
Okay, thank you.